Good morning, John. Good to see you.
Good morning, Nick. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. John, so you're an engineer by profession. By most people's standards, you're an exceptionally successful businessman. You're also a very experienced investor. And if I don't mind saying, you've got numerous investments across a variety of arenas, across, I think, 3 continents. So it's fair to say you know your way around this investment space. So thanks for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure.
Something that I think you probably equipped to answer, which may not be an easy question to answer, is the last half a decade or so, investments across the board have generally performed quite poorly, I would think. Where do investors go? What do they need to look for to try and get them out of this cycle?
You know, Nick, I suppose it sounds like a bit of a cliche, but my simple answer to that is value. What is value? What's a value investment? I think traditionally people have gone to banks. Banks have been giving, I suppose, reasonable interest rates. Certain fund managers, boast certain rates that they can give you. For me, as an investor, I always look at what I perceive value to be. And if the value isn't there for a long term, I presume that we're talking about long-term investment or medium-term investment. I'm not talking about speculative, short-term investment.
Yes.
So, yes, my simple answer to that would be value, Nick. And I don't know if you would want to get into now what I would see as value, but just as a term, I would say look for value. Don't follow the crowd, because we're finding that the history and sort of where those crowd sort of also ran investments used to be, those days are gone. There's no more value in those investments, in my opinion.
What's your view on those people who refuse to look beyond the parameters of the norm or traditional investments and refuse to look at alternative means of investing? Do you have an opinion on those guys and how they should look at things to get ahead?
Indeed. I think that as a sort of cliched sort of statement is that on fund managers' fact sheets, they talk about beware of past performance, because that's not indicative of future performance. So I think because people have been used to relatively good returns, in a rising tide in a market, everything rises. So it's very easy to stick with those fund managers, with the banks, with the savings accounts. So because we're no longer in a rising tide market, I think that individuals are now forced to look for alternative avenues.
But are they, is the question. And is that what you're seeing amongst your, let's call it, your colleagues, your social setup? Are people looking for new investments, or are they not changing their psychology around investments per se?
Sadly not. And I call it the lemming culture. People are generally set in their ways when it comes to investments. I believe good investors are born to a degree, and to a lesser degree are made. So, and in saying that would suggest that it's very difficult to change the mindset of a traditional investor, or what a traditional investor perceives to be good investment. So I'm not quite sure how one changes that mindset, but I think it's very necessary in the current market where, as I said earlier, the rising tide no longer exists. We're now in a receding tide, and it's now more than ever important to look around and change that strategy. It's your job to see how you can get the lemming culture to become, for them to look around.
Johnny, you've raised a very, very good point. You've just said that you think that sometimes good investors are born. So is there a trick to investing? Can people follow ABC of investing, or do you actually think that some people are just naturally talented and everyone else has to try and learn as much as they can about it?
Nick, I think the answer to that is to see value. Value is a perception. If your perception of what value is turns out to be true, and you find that trusting that perception more often than not does lead to it eventually becoming true, then I guess you would say that you're a born investor. But I have had relatively good success in sort of trusting that perception. And I think that that is important, very important.
So on that note, you trust your perception. So what is it that ultimately drew you towards us to investing with us?
A propensity to not deal with the banks, some really bad experiences with fund managers. My experience in my personal capacity and in my business capacity with the banks has been dismal. Banks are a necessary evil, unfortunately. We rely on them to look after our money. When we rely on them to look after our investments, I think that their performance is dismal, to say the least. There's so many hurdles, there's so many fees, there's so many costs. I believe that we work for the banks. The banks don't really work for us. I think that, if we look at the big cats, the big fund houses, I don't have to mention them, I think everybody knows. If I look at the lack of risk that is taken by those fund managers to look after my investment, on the pure basis that whether the fund performs or doesn't perform, I get charged a fee, I have a problem with that. Even worse than that is if they do perhaps perform slightly high above the benchmark, they would like a performance bonus fee on top of that. So in that type of investment scenario, I've spoken about banks, I've spoken about funds now, where it kind of seems to be a win-win situation for both of those institutions.
Yeah.
I don't really see how that benefits me. If I knew nothing about investment and I would rely on so-called fund experts to come up and advise me on where should I invest, I guess that's better than just letting your money sit in the bank. But it doesn't tweak or tick the boxes for me because it's a win-win situation for them. Too often I've seen funds perform badly, and it's the old, who could have seen that coming?
Yeah.
Whilst the fees get deducted off your account. So that did lead me to seek other investment opportunities. There is the old adage, safe as houses, and I think where my portfolio lacked, I dabbled early on in my younger years at renovations of property, and I'm involved in a property sort of investment company. But I was a bit thin on the ground in investing in property, and it was a part of my portfolio that I did need to address. How do you go about it? If you are not a developer and you're not a builder, and you're not very smart in the market in terms of knowing where to buy and how to buy, and I think all those boxes were ticked. For me, to find a company that acquires the land, does the construction, does the procurement, handles the sales, it really is an end-to-end situation. You don't charge me a fee. You bring to me an opportunity with an end-to-end consolidated package in a market where my portfolio has been lacking. So, Nick, it was a bit of a no-brainer actually. It was a slam dunk for me.